Okay. So, like I said, this is the last workshop in our Complete Street Summer Series, and this has been part of the Nuvisions virtual learning series at CDTC. This webinar has been approved for 1.5 AICP credits, so you will receive an attendance certificate if you attend today's entire workshop. If you attended a past Nuvisions workshop and haven't received a certificate and would like one in order to claim your credit, please contact me and I will get one to you. If you're a planning or zoning board member and your municipality has approved CDTC events and trainings, it does meet the New York State training requirements. If you have questions, you can contact your local government to see if they've been approved or if CDTC events and webinars can be approved. So while this is the last in the Complete Street series, we do have an ongoing virtual learning series. Each month we focus on a different topic. September, we will be looking at economic development trends in the region and how they're related to the transportation system. If there's a topic or certain transportation planning strategy that you're interested in and that you'd like us to focus on, we are always open to recommendations and ideas. So you can email us at nuvisions@cdtcmpo.org. For information about registering for this upcoming webinar, you can visit our website. If you are interested in past webinars that you were not able to attend, we are recording this one, and we've recorded previous webinars and have uploaded them to the CDTC YouTube channel. So you can go back and you can watch them, but you cannot get AICP credits. They're on our website. You can also find the other Nuvisions resources and materials. So today we are going to be focusing on open streets. Now, open streets is something, is a concept, a topic that we've been talking about for a while, but they've become particularly popular during COVID. So we're going to start with an overview of Nuvisions 2050, kind of the core principles. We'll talk about CDTC's Complete Streets program, and then the local COVID mobility trends that kind of created the context and the conditions to make open streets popular. And then we're going to hand it off to our consultant team, Planning for Places, and Sam Schwartz Engineering, to really go into the details on what is open streets, what are some examples of successful projects, and maybe how you can implement it in your community. We'll end with a summary, with a discussion. If you have questions throughout the webinar, we will address them at the end. You can put them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will get to them. So a quick introduction about the Capital District Transportation Committee. And I know a lot of you are familiar with CDTC and have attended our previous workshops, so I will try and make this brief. The CDTC is a metropolitan planning organization for New York's capital region. An MPO is a transportation policy making and planning organization, and we allocate federal transportation funding resources for local transportation, infrastructure projects, and planning programs. The CDTC includes all of the 78-ish municipalities in the capital region, the counties of Albany, Rensselaer, Schenectady, and Saratoga County, minus kind of that northeast corner of the town of Monroe and South Glens Falls. We also include regional transportation and planning organizations like the State Department of Transportation, the Capital District Regional Planning Commission, the Transit Agency, the airport, the port, and the thruway. Nuvisions 2050 is one of CDTC's major products. It's our long-range regional transportation plan. It's a blueprint for regional transportation that reflects a shared vision for our future. And it was developed collaboratively with the public and with stakeholders in the region. And it was adopted last September. If you haven't, or if you're not already familiar with Nuvisions, there is a great summary document that kind of pulls it all together and explains what the major ideas, major topics, themes, strategies are in the plan. But there are other components, including a systems performance report, a public participation plan, and 11 separate technical area papers, everything from transit to congestion to bicycling and walking. And then there's also a financial plan, and all these documents can be found on the CDTC website. If you're wondering what the implementation of Nuvisions 2050 looks like, these are just some examples of major infrastructure investments that have been constructed because of the priorities and strategies laid out in previous Nuvisions plans. So really, Nuvisions and the strategies within it make it possible for the region to implement these big transportation infrastructure projects. And the Nuvisions planning and investment principles are the centerpiece of this plan. There's 15 principles, and these influence the types of tasks and initiatives that CDTC supports. So as you can see, invest in complete streets is its own principle, but many of our other principles are related to implementing complete streets and creating a more a safe, walkable, multimodal, and livable capital region. And in addition to the principles, you'll find some major policy and best practice recommendations in the Nuvisions plan. And one of these includes implementing complete streets. And, you know, over the last decade, CDTC has seen support for complete streets grow. And during the Nuvisions plan update, we engaged the public and our stakeholders and ask them how they feel about different modes and spending in the region. And through surveys and virtual public meetings and an interactive funding poll we had set up, we did confirm that there was still quite a significant amount of support for complete streets. So the Nuvisions 2050 plan outlines a strategy for maintaining and improving a $30 billion system of roads, bridges, sidewalks, and trails to support continued economic growth in the region. We're a slow growth region, and projections do not predict a significant increase in the future, but the development continues to occur. A lot of development has happened on the edges of already developed towns and cities. So we are seeing some increases in driving because of the type of development. So complete streets, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach to street design. It requires careful consideration of all road users, including trucks, moving freight, transit, cyclists, people experiencing a mobility disability, children and older adults. And of course, we need to look at land use and how we are planning our communities to create more walkable, multimodal communities. So, you know, what can we afford to do right now? And what can we work towards doing over time as resources become available is something that Nuvisions lays out, and something that we continue to talk about and discuss at CDTC. So we are in the implementation stage of Nuvisions 2050. Some of the other major CDTC products that help implement the long-range plan include our Unified Planning Work Program and the Transportation Improvement Program, which is a 5-year capital program. We continue to host the Nuvisions virtual learning series each month. But if your planning board, zoning board, town board, or city council would like training, if you want training on a specific topic or just a presentation on what is a Nuvisions or what are the major strategies and principles in Nuvisions, CDTC would be happy to attend your planning board, zoning board, town board, or city council. To do that, you can email me or request a training on our website at cdtcmpo.org/NV2050. So like I said, CDTC supports Complete Streets, and one of the ways that we do that is through our Complete Streets program, which is in our Unified Planning Work Program. And Carrie Ward from CDTC is going to just briefly talk about what CDTC does in the program and other resources that are available.
Thanks, Jen. So this slide summarizes the main topics in our Complete Streets program. So first, we are actually working on a Complete Streets design guidelines that would be applicable throughout the region. They're close to being done, and they are heavily inspired by similar work that was done for the state of New Jersey. If you could look at that one as well, we thought it was a good model. We have an educational and technical workshop series, of which this is part this year. But in general, for that program, we meet municipalities where they are to help transportation planning practitioners and decision makers identify and overcome complete streets policy and implementation barriers. We do conduct a solicitation every other year for that, and as of now, the next one is planned for early 2022. We document the project outcomes for federally funded transportation projects that included some kind of complete streets elements like a sidewalks or transit stop infrastructure in their funding application. And then finally, we have a Complete Streets advisory group of municipal representatives that discuss regional progress and coordination efforts, including with upcoming state projects that the State Department of Transportation is undertaking. Next slide. Nuvisions has performance measures for different program areas, and that includes for Complete Streets. So for the Complete Streets, we're looking at the number of Complete Streets policies that cities, towns, villages have, the number of training sessions and attendance at those, the number of federally funded construction projects that include some kind of Complete Streets elements, municipal maintenance of year-round usability, and mostly we're referring there to snow removal on sidewalks, which is an issue, and then municipal use of checklists for projects, which could be private development projects. It could also be municipal public works projects. Next slide. All right, so in general at CDTC, we have two main programs to provide planning assistance. The Transportation and Community Linkage Program provides funding for local governments to prepare community-based transportation and land use plans consistent with Nuvisions 2050 planning and investment principles. And then we have a technical assistance program that has a rolling deadline and is for small scale planning needs, such as data collection, data analysis, transportation safety and operations planning, general community or neighborhood planning, and also recreational trail planning. Next slide. So we do collect data that we can make available, including a sidewalk and bicycle inventory. The map on the right is showing the results of our sidewalk inventory for the region, bicycle and trail counts, and survey templates and data. so, any of the results of this are things that we can provide to you. The safety data would be at a more regional scale, not at a fine-grained level. Next slide. And then this slide has some funding resources. The Capital Coexist mini grants are for small scale transportation safety, education, and training programs within CDTC's emphasis areas of vulnerable roadway users, road user behavior, younger and older drivers, speed, intersections, and roadway departures. Transportation Improvement Program is the list of construction projects receiving federal funding, and we do conduct a solicitation for much of that funding about every 3 years. The Transportation Alternatives Program and the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality funds support bicycle, pedestrian, multi-use path, and non-motorized transportation related projects and programs. For the last few years in New York State, those have been solicited together, and that solicitation is currently open with the deadline at the end of September. The Recreational Trails program provides funds to develop and maintain recreational trails and trail-related facilities for both non-motorized and motorized recreational trail uses. That program is administered by the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, and just looked that up, and it looks like the solicitation for that just passed. Next slide. And then this slide is just has a number of other resources on it. Not planning to read them, but please feel free to let us know if you would like more information about any of them or how you could use them in your work. And next slide.
All right, thank you, Carrie. So the next few slides are just going to briefly talk about some mobility trends related to COVID and some of the stay-at-home guidelines that were issued last year. Many communities responded to stay-at-home guidelines and social distancing guidelines by closing streets, reducing speed limits, and or limiting vehicle access to residents only so that people could use the whole street and not crowd onto narrow sidewalks when people were getting out. A lot of people were at home, but people were getting outside a lot. And CDTC, we've been monitoring and compiling as much data that we can locally and watching other trends statewide and nationally as they've become as information's become available. But this is just some information that we have from the Capital Region and elsewhere. So this is from a company called Streetlight, and it uses cell phone probe data to measure vehicle traffic. So as you can see, when New York State on pause took effect on March 22nd, traffic activity significantly dropped, and we slowly saw an increase. It almost recovered to baseline regionally by the end of last summer. We were seeing some recovery on roadways like the Northway by early fall. We haven't looked at very recent data, but still in late winter, Wolf Road had not completely recovered. Route 9 was getting close to recovering. So as you can see, there was a significant drop in traffic during the early part of the COVID-19 pandemic. Other related mobility trends, of course, air travel, especially by, passengers, also plummeted. We saw commercial travel kind of dip and then rebound a bit. CDTA ridership also, declined and is still trying to recover. And then this is just a snapshot from Apple mobility trends, and this is people using Apple Maps for directions. So it's not incredibly comprehensive, but it does just give you an idea. And as you can see, the number of people walking increased quite a bit. And this is for Albany as of March 7th of this year. Streetlight Data put out a report on bicycling in the US during COVID in September, and it showed that smaller cities and metro areas saw an increase of about 25 to 75% in bicycling. And we don't have a lot of bicycle count data for the capital region, but anecdotally, we did hear from a lot of communities and also see staff saw ourselves a lot more people out bicycling. Bicycle shops reported shortages of bikes. Our bike rescues were getting bikes to essential workers to get people to work. So we did see a lot more people out bicycling. We did trail counts to just confirm what we were seeing on trails. A lot of big regional multi-use trails were pretty crowded. So we did a spot check on the Zim Smith Trail, and we saw a huge increase in use, whereas the Albany Shaker Trail, which is in Latham by the airport and not very close to any residents, it's really surrounded by office and commercial, and the airport saw a significant decrease in use. So I think that reflected who was at home and who was out and where people were. Other impacts to the transportation system, we saw transportation infrastructure and systems shift pretty significantly to accommodate the needs during the pandemic. So of course, parking lots and other facilities became drive-through COVID testing. We saw parking garages in other parts of the country be used for other types of uses. The Albany Airport became a drive-through food pantry. If you go to some shopping plazas, you'll now see some spots marked for curbside parking only, where people were ordering things and choosing contactless pickup, where they would just wait in their car and people would come out to them. Also a lot of delivery, like Uber Eats and Grubhub and other delivery services increased. You saw a lot of curb space designated just for restaurant pickup, or again, curbside pickup only. And then CDTA really chipped in with the effort in the region just to keep people moving through the pandemic. And then also as we were recovering with vaccinations, the trolleys were used to get people to FEMA vaccination sites. And now CDTA has partnered with some other health departments in the region to get vaccinations to people. So a real flexibility and quick thinking and shifting of our transportation system. I think it's important as we talk about the COVID-19 pandemic, sometimes people framed it as an opportunity to rethink things or an opportunity to expand our walking and bicycling amenities. But I think that it's important to remember that it is a global pandemic, and that not everyone experienced it the same way. And there were different levels of privilege and how we viewed how things were being done, and that there were people who continue to get up and go to work every day and really relied on the transportation system to get them to work. And we relied on them to be there for our groceries and for medical care and other services. So, as we continue to talk about this, I think remembering accessibility for people with mobility impairments and accessibility and prioritizing people who still need to travel and get to work and make a living, even while the rest of us may be able to stay at home and continue to work and stay safe. So with that, I am going to pass it over to our consultant team. We have Kathy Ember from Planning for Places, who will introduce her team and take it from here.
Thanks, Jen. We're just going to share our screen and then we'll get started. Okay, next slide, please. So my name is Kathy Ember. I'm founding principal of Planning for Places. Planning for Places and Sam Schwartz have been conducting the Complete Streets workshops for CDTC, as was mentioned, and CDTC has sponsored these Complete Streets educational workshops every year since 2016. We've done about 10 total, and we've reached hundreds of local elected officials, municipal staff, and volunteers, advocacy groups, and others who have participated. So I just want to introduce the other presenters. We have Mike Flynn, principal from Sam Schwartz as well, and Leon Fari, senior transportation planner, who will also be talking today. Next slide, please. So just wanted to go over what we're going to be covering. Today's presentation will start with an overview of OpenStreet's basics. And we also included a number of examples throughout the US and the world to share. And we'll be reviewing public engagement strategies. We'll also discuss implementation of OpenStreets and how to evaluate their success. And we'll also do some examples and focus on some examples of recent OpenStreets in terms of during the COVID-19 period and also in the Hudson Valley, the capital region, New York City. And we'll wrap up and include some helpful OpenStreets resources at the end of presentation. I just want to note that if you have anything that you would like to ask while we're talking, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A, and we'll try to accommodate your question or during our presentation. But if we don't get to it, we'll definitely discuss it during the end of the discussion. Next slide, please. So we're going to start with a poll. And Jen, if you wouldn't mind starting that poll, we just want to get a sense of what type of organization you represent. Maybe you're just here by yourself, and what your interest is in OpenStreets. So if everyone wouldn't mind chiming in, if you're from a government agency or a local government.
Can everyone see the poll? Sorry.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Planning and Zoning Board, if you're from there, or a neighborhood group, an advocacy organization, or you're just here yourself, or if there's another category that fits you. And we'll give you a few minutes to fill that out. We're also like to hear about your interest in OpenStreets. If you're just looking for information, if your community is planning an OpenStreets project, if you're interested but you're not sure, you're currently working on one, or you have done an OpenStreets project. So we'll make sure that as many participants participate as possible, and then we'll close the poll. Okay, we have 67% participation so far. So we'll give you all a few more seconds here. Last call. Oh, there's still some more. Okay, I'll give you another couple seconds here. All right, I'm going to end the poll and we'll share the results. So looks like mostly people from government agencies or local governments, but also some people from planning and zoning boards or neighborhood groups, or they're just here on their own. And it sounds like a lot of people just want to get information today, which is great. Well, hopefully we'll be able to share important information for you and help answer any questions you have. And it doesn't look like that many people have done OpenStreets projects themselves. Okay, great. Well, thank you for that information. It's really helpful as we go forward and discuss OpenStreets. So if you could go to the next slide, please. We'll get started with OpenStreet basics. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Kathy. Well, maybe hopefully after today, some of you will be inspired to champion OpenStreets in your community. So we wanted to start by just giving an overview of what we mean by OpenStreets and what different forms they can take. it's kind of a catch-all term, and people have used it to mean a few different things. But basically, it's streets that prioritize people walking and biking by essentially turning the street into public space. And there's different ways to do that. You can do it by totally closing it, or maybe allowing just local traffic, or by just creating more pedestrian space within the road. And open streets allow for a range of activities. So, some are more oriented to physical activity, or socializing, or even supporting schools and businesses, just creating space. And we've seen it evolve, which I'll talk about in a moment, during the pandemic. And open streets are places where basically people of any background, any physical or other ability level, different ages, can come out and socialize, get exercise, and have access to open space. Next. They're free. These are public space. They're generally, if they're not full time, they're regularly occurring, and sometimes they're part of a formal program. We'll talk about some, the larger ones that we saw before the pandemic. Sometimes they're neighborhood based. Sometimes they're part of a more formal kind of municipal program. And basically, they allow communities to experience their streets in a whole different way, and really kind of experience their neighborhood in a different way than they would normally, when there's really this clear delineation between space for cars, space for people, and open space is often thought of as parks, right? More formal kinds of open space. And oftentimes we see open streets coordinated in partnership with community organizations. There's, because they are kind of happening at the neighborhood level, they're a great opportunity for that type of grassroots partnership. And we'll talk a little more about that later. So I think one important thing to keep in mind is that open streets can take a lot of forms, kind of on a spectrum. What you see here basically is something that's really larger scale, more formal, maybe in more, busy areas on the left, where you might have miles and miles of streets that have been pedestrianized, but maybe it's only happening, one day a year or a couple of days a year. On the right, you've got, more kind of neighborhood streets that are, kind of doing a similar function, but maybe are not fully closed to cars. Maybe they're allowing local traffic, and maybe instead of the city running the show, there's a neighborhood group or even just residents who are putting out these barriers and kind of maintaining it. And something else we'll include for the purposes of today, which is kind of in the middle here, is not really fully pedestrianizing streets, but other approaches, that kind of create more of a shared experience on the street, that make the street feel more like a public space. So that could include things like you see here, like parklets, where part of the parking lane is taken to, or is reallocated to serve as public space for public seating, for restaurant seating, and things like that. So, it's a building block, and it can be part of a strategy for open streets, especially, when we think about it in the sense that open streets have kind of a physical dimension, right? Which part of the street is sort of being opened up to pedestrians. And they also have a time dimension. Is it happening all day? Is it happening only certain times of day, certain days of the week, maybe only a few times a year? Next. So we've seen an evolution in the kind of the concept of open streets, really from before the pandemic. I don't know if I can say after, but to, kind of what we've learned from what's happened during the pandemic. Before the pandemic, open streets were seen as kind of this more formal, large scale program where basically cities would take major roads or series of roads, parkways, maybe through parks, connecting parks, and close them generally just on the weekend and maybe just for a few hours, maybe just for one or two or a few times a year. And it was really oriented towards, recreation. People can go out, walk, bike, rollerblade, skateboard, scooter, and, kind of be out there with their neighbors, get exercise, have fun. But it's basically recreational, and maybe some, other kinds of static activities, maybe some, workout classes or dance classes or things like that. But it's really this larger scale kind of idea. Next. So some examples of this, Seattle's actually had a very long running program called Bicycle Sundays. Just closes a 3-mile stretch of streets that basically connect some of their key public space and parks. And they open them on Sundays for people walking and biking and things like that. And it's really kind of a recreational program, and it's run by the city government and funded by them. Kind of one of the most famous is actually in Bogota, Colombia, which is Ciclovia. That's been around since 1974. Again, it was really created to sort of have an equitable, opportunity for anybody, no matter their background, to get out, to get exercise, to experience the city, to have fun out on the streets. And that's huge. That's about 75 miles of city streets. And over time, they've added more activities to it, like, exercise classes and things like that. And that's also a government run program. Portland, Oregon is similar to Seattle's. Their Sunday Parkways began in 2008. They tend to switch up the route, just goes through different neighborhoods and basically provides an opportunity, for folks to get out there and explore. They get some private sponsorship, but it's primarily a public program. And then Los Angeles took a page from Bogota. They called their program Ciclovia, like LA. And they started that in 2010. And they also tend to rotate the routes. They try to, kind of give all the neighborhoods an opportunity to participate in this over time. And it's actually mainly led by some of their local nonprofits. Barcelona has gotten some recognition for their Superblocks program, and this is different. This is not kind of a one-off, street opening like the last 4. This is something that's more permanent, and it's a little different in nature. So they basically have these large blocks, of buildings between their major roads that have more local streets. And what they've done basically is they've pedestrianized those local streets that are on the interior of these super blocks. And, they've worked with local artists and local groups to kind of design them and program them, and basically have created a network of walking and biking routes on these sort of interior blocks. And they do allow, local traffic for folks to be able to access, let's say, a garage or people who need to make deliveries or things like that. But this is a, kind of a more formal, permanent program that the city's been doing, that they've been basically expanding for the last 5 or more years. So what we've seen, during the pandemic is a move, number one, to make open streets more permanent, and number two, to not only see them as, just kind of a recreational amenity, but maybe as something, maybe more important than that. So, thinking of it more as creating public space, especially in neighborhoods that may have limited open space. So, denser neighborhoods, areas with multifamily housing, and things like that, approaching it with a little more of an equity lens. So there was this interesting article in the New York Times, maybe some of you saw about a week ago, about kind of the future of open streets, and it looks specifically at New York City, and in particular at kind of the signature open street there, which is in Jackson Heights, a neighborhood in Queens on 34th Avenue. And that's been made permanent, although there's been a healthy debate, and there's been some kind of, as there always is, change can be challenging. Changing the routines people are used to, or if people were used to being able to pull right up in front of their apartment, and now it's a little bit harder. But basically, on the whole, there's been a lot of support to make this permanent, maybe even to raise the capital funding to build it out in some way, in a more permanent way someday. There's a neighborhood coalition that's formed that basically takes care of the open street, that puts out the barriers at each block, that basically only allow the local traffic. And it's a pretty interesting case study of, how cities can approach open streets a little differently than just seeing it as, a nice recreational thing, but rather something that can be part of the public space infrastructure of a community. So there's a few different typologies for open streets. Some are oriented towards a specific event, like the Ciclavia we mentioned, or maybe a street fair. Others we've seen, especially during the pandemic, even in some of the local communities here in the capital region, to allow for outdoor dining. We've seen open streets to support outdoor play. I know that Newburgh had the design competition kind of looking at this, and then even for schools, right? Like if you're thinking about crowding and social distancing, there was a push to basically repurpose streets in areas that don't have as much space to allow certain school-related activities to happen outside. And of course, things like public markets, in some cases have been happening for a long time, where streets are closed sometimes to allow for farmers markets or other things like that. Excuse me. So a few examples of kind of pandemic era open streets. Oakland, California received a fair amount of attention for their program. It was pretty big given the size of the city. It's over 25 miles of these, what they're calling soft closures. So kind of what you see in the picture here. Cars are still allowed, but you have to, go very slowly, and basically it's just for local traffic. And they rolled it out pretty quickly. There's an interesting kind of more detailed story there, which, maybe if time permits later, I can talk a little more about, or you could take a research, where they had a little bit of pushback in their initial rollout, and they took kind of a different tack where they worked more hand in hand with the communities and kind of adjusted their program. Next. Paris, obviously a much bigger city, they had their Corona cycleways. And I think what was noteworthy about this is that they really repurposed quite a bit of car space on the roads, car lanes, to do this. And the mayor there, said that she's going to make it permanent. Much of it will be permanent. So this is, it wasn't just during the kind of peak of the pandemic when car traffic was much lower, but actually, looking at this as a more long-term strategy to create more space for walking, cycling, and transit. The part of that was, these over 50 miles of cycle tracks or protected bike lanes, basically, that are now gradually being made permanent. So, we need to think about the overall mobility network when we do this. We need to, if you're thinking about open streets, it makes sense to kind of identify, the corridors, either based on, if you're expecting it to be used by residents, is it based on residential density? Do you want it to connect to things like parks, or is it more of a commercial open street? And then, thinking about, does it make sense to pedestrianize it and close it to car traffic all day, parts of the day, certain days of the week? A lot of cities and towns have done these partial closures as a way of, striking a balance, and maybe it's an easier lift, right, than fully pedestrianizing things, and it could be kind of an interim step too. At major intersections, you can consider that soft closure idea, where local traffic's allowed, kind of what you see up in the top picture here, where you leave a gap for local traffic, but through traffic's not allowed. Or you could do a full closure. Obviously, if it's going to affect transit routes, you need to coordinate with your transit agency, such as CDTA, on temporary rerouting. But you always, at all times, need to make sure that you're preserving emergency access.
We also wanted to highlight some public engagement techniques for putting in open streets installations. They're often, as we kind of mentioned already, public and private partnerships, and both groups who are involved in the open streets installation really need to be engaged from the start to make it work well. So part of that is engaging the local business organizations to help reach out to business owners when you're putting in, let's say, an outdoor dining or retail open streets installation. And we'd encourage everyone who's looking at this to also consider trying a demonstration project as well as a precursor to a more permanent or seasonal installation, because that helps you solicit public input and get feedback on the installation. You hear from business owners and the public about what works and what doesn't, and might help shape the design details of the installation. And we've seen that going forward in the pandemic in basically both summers, from the first time it was installed to the second season. So one thing that's helpful to do is to showcase examples of similar size or local municipalities, things that worked well, that were well received in similar situations. And that helps start that conversation of what you want to have in your open streets in your municipality. Next slide, please. So one of the examples we wanted to highlight was the village of Reinbeck, especially in terms of public engagement. And we're also going to talk about it a little bit later in their presentation. They had an extensive public engagement process starting actually in the second season. They had an installation in 2020, but after that they created an outdoor dining task force that included village officials and restaurant managers and owners, retail owners, and residents, following that first round of outdoor dining in 2020. And part of that process involved creating applications for the outdoor dining and retail permits, but they also did 3 public input sessions. They had an opportunity for submitting written comments as well. And part of their process, because it was on a state road, is also developing a fully engineered plan for the open streets installation in coordination with NISDOT, who was the road owner. And in addition, they had a survey. Next slide, please. So we'd really, encourage reaching out to a variety of stakeholders as you're creating an open streets installation. That could include resident associations beyond the business district community, community organizations, bicycle and pedestrian advocacy organizations, or health coalitions. Schools are a good resource to get the word out about an open streets installation. Mutual aid organizations are also helpful. And then, make sure to partner with stakeholders and advocates and use their networks to advertise the open streets project that you're working on, to place flyers in convenient locations where people will see them. That could be helpful in contacting local residents safely as well. And so continue, connecting with community groups to identify any obstacles or issues that affect the design or time frame or implementation of it. If you're going from a temporary to permanent installation, that's particularly important. And, Mike did mention, the roles of volunteers is really important. And the example of the 34th Avenue, where a volunteer coalition is helping to put out the barriers and take them down. The key is thinking about roles and responsibilities. So who is responsible to put out the barriers? Is it volunteers? Is it the police or traffic officers? Figuring that out is really important, and continuing the volunteer recruiting and training so that every day when you open it up again, if you're, opening and closing, you make sure you have a consistent group of people and it's done successfully and it goes off very smoothly. Next slide, please.
Next, we want to talk about the implementation and what you need to make sure you're taking into consideration. So as Mike mentioned, we like to look at what is the appropriate location for an implementation of an open streets? We're going to look at a specific corridor and network of streets that could be closed for vehicular traffic. We're going to identify whether it's a closure for temporary a few hours of the day, few days of the weeks, or permanently. As mentioned before, equity is a big part of the decision making when we're looking at the location and trying to identify locations that are with need for open space. Another consideration is whether you need to keep the on-street parking or you should disallow it for the time of the closure. And that depends on the activities and the character of the open streets. You also want to look at the proposed plans in the area, whether there are greenways or bike boulevards or other routes that are looking to have a project implemented. They could be identified as a good location to test the open streets as a first step before implementation of a more complete street project. If you see a location that you think would be difficult for a complete closure, then you can consider a slow streets that allow for local traffic access. Again, when you're having resource constraints, then you can downsize the amount of space and the number of blocks that you're going to include in the program. Look at 2 blocks for play streets or something that is in a smaller scale than the bigger event that we've seen before. In terms of logistics and materials, there are a few basic things that you could use to create an open street. So the simple materials you're going to use are barricades to close the street. And again, you might have staff involved to monitor and enforce where necessary. You can look at location where you'll have volunteers do that, and other location, if it's a higher volume of traffic, you might want to have traffic enforcement made by the police. If we're looking at a volunteer group, then a community group can coordinate on a weekly schedule through the shared calendar about, their assigned for putting the barriers in and out. It's important to have high visibility barricades and cones that will identify, help inform vehicles and drivers about the change in the network. Also include signage that explain the road closure, that this is part of a program, and suggest alternative routes. So you want to have a temporary road closure sign, and in some location you might consider also pedestrian or cyclist signs to help inform what is the new use of the street at this location for the open street period. And as mentioned before, programming is a big and exciting piece of open streets. It will bring different community members together. It could help attract broader audience to the location, helps build community and stewardship, and establish something that is more reoccurring and a seasonal event. Some ideas could be from exercise, classes, and games to art, music, festivals, cultural events, pop-up library or movies, and anything that the community members would enjoy and will help facilitate building stewardship. A very important piece of implementing OpenStreet is the evaluation. So why is it important to evaluate the OpenStreet's implementation? First of all, you can use that to improve your program and to guide improvements in the futures in other locations. It's also demonstrate the effectiveness of that. So if you want to repeat and you have some objection or discussion, then you can show valuable data that shows the number of participation or how you can grow and expand this in other locations. If you have funding or private investors that are involved, they also would like to see any data that support the success of an open street. And you can also contribute to a global research, global knowledge and other locations where they're trying to implement these kind of open street treatment. So how would you do evaluation? One part would be just a participation count. You want to understand who are the participants that are using the streets, what few basic demographic characteristic, including gender, whether we're looking at adults, kids, elderly, and also what are they doing when they're at the open streets, what kind of activity they're engaged with. You can use surveys to gather this information and ask about demographic, the time that they spend, the activities, and any other feedback that they might have for the open streets. Another aspect that we mentioned before is the connection to local businesses and the cost benefit for them. So you want to see whether more people spend more time and then spend more money, number of customers, increase of awareness of stores and restaurants in this specific location. So these are kind of metrics that will help convince more collaboration with local businesses and show the win-win situation of having an open streets for the business community. Another level is to understand the activity, so what participants are doing, biking, walking, any activity hubs that they're engaging with, and how long they've been physically in the open streets. We want to have participants tell us how did they hear about this open streets, and if they live in, where do they live in relation, so we understand the catch area of this event. Moving to some open street examples.
Thank you. So we wanted to highlight a couple examples, both in the Hudson Valley and the Capital Region, and also in some more in New York City. So we're going to start with the Village of Reinbeck. We'll also talk about Ballston Spa, the Village of Ballston Spa, city of Saratoga Springs, and 2 places in the Bronx and Queens. So in Reinbeck, in the village, it was first undertaken in 2020. I think I previously mentioned that there were significant coordination efforts involved with NISDOT as it is a state-owned road. The outdoor dining was placed in existing on-street parking spaces. It was established in the center of the village. They reestablished it in 2021. And the barriers that they put in, the concrete barriers that you can see on the right, basically ended up establishing a gateway. It made traffic speeds, they were kind of slow anyway in the village because of the amount of activity, but it definitely made it slower, and the barriers basically created like a neck down and slowed traffic even more. It became much more of a pedestrian friendly environment. And the survey I mentioned earlier showed that 3/4 of respondents felt that the benefits of the expanded dining and retail space outweighed any loss of on-street parking spaces. And one of the reasons that's really significant is often a complaint about installing complete streets is related to the loss of on-street parking when more pedestrian bicycle infrastructure is installed. And so, it really ultimately comes down to the benefits of bringing more activity, more pedestrian bicycle space, outdoor dining, parking basically can be accommodated elsewhere. And it's a nice way of, learning that we don't always have to worry about parking so much going forward. Next slide, please. So, again, some on-street parking was retained. They did have to do a fully engineered open streets plan, and they also retained the pedestrian way on the sidewalk. In the second year, you see in this image on the right, the concrete barriers were painted. In some cases, murals were put on, and there were also more finished spaces with a common design theme. So they kind of expanded upon the initial more temporary materials and made it a little bit more of a design, more of a common theme going forward. And that seems to be happening in a lot of the installations that came back in the second year. Next slide. So French Street and Ballston Spa, this is slightly different in that it didn't end up coming back as much in the second year, but in the first year in 2020, they did a temporary closure for 3 nights, Thursday through Saturday, I think. And they used just really temporary materials, sawhorses, cones, see that small sign there with the no parking, that it was very basic materials. It was really popular. They did retain some on-street parking on one side. They also retain the pedestrian way on the sidewalk. But, what was interesting is that it didn't stay that way in the second year. So what happened was, they did create an open streets policy. They had allowed tables to be placed on the sidewalks adjacent to eating establishments as long as there was a 4-foot open pathway for pedestrians. Restaurants were also allowed to put outdoor dining in their parking lots as well. But what ended up happening in the second year was that they found that the restaurants, because indoor dining was allowed again more, the capacity limits had changed. They found that they didn't actually request the space as much in the second year, which is a little bit unusual. A lot of the other places continued a kind of robust outdoor dining program. So they ended up only having one restaurant requesting it this year. And so they only have basically the parklet design now, where there's a little space in the parking area in front of one restaurant that is blocked off with concrete barriers. Next slide, please. So in Saratoga Springs, they also had an outdoor dining program, and they still have that. It started in 2020. They used the parking lane, and you could see the concrete barriers in the two photos with a lot of they did a lot of landscaping, a lot of decorations, lights. They had area rugs, it was quite extensive. And they allowed outdoor dining on sidewalks and on street parking lanes, and they are still continuing to have that. And they were able to accommodate, sidewalk, pedestrian way on the sidewalk, and ADA access and deliveries as well. Next, please.
Next example is actually from New York, and this is the first open street restaurant that was implemented in the city. We worked with the local BID, Business Improvement District. This area is known to be Little Italy in the Bronx. There is a corridor with many establishments of mostly restaurants that are very active and really needed the outdoor space. So we worked with them on a plan to how to reconfigure traffic diversion in the area to allow for 2 blocks of closure and allow for the outdoor dining during specific times over the weekend. And this was a reoccurring event through 2020 and coming back in 2021 as well. And another example would be from Queens, Dietmar Boulevard. What's interesting here is that a group of restaurants owners came together and created this group with a shared interest to create this space for more outdoor dining. And that was a little more challenging because Dietmar Boulevard has both transit, it has a bus lane here that go through the corridor, and another limitation was a firehouse here that needed to go through the area as well. So we needed some more coordination, but eventually we were able to reroute the bus lane to accommodate the street closure for the weekends as well. So that's another success story and a more local example of how stakeholders come together to share a specific need and create a space that will address that. So we're wrapping up with a few kind of bullet points on what is the importance of open streets and really seeing it as a platform for a change. As we mentioned before in the presentation, this is an opportunity to start a process, to have something as a demonstration, to go further into a permanent project. There is a lot of opportunity to work on engagement and work with community and volunteer groups, so building stewardships and building interest around this topic. And in general, what open streets could provide a community is improvement of quality of life and more public space, promoting social capital. If we're looking on the more recreational open streets, so talking about cycling and encouraging cycling as a form of transportation. By closing the street for vehicular traffic, we're also helping with climate change goals, so reducing pollution and street noise, and increasing the business activity and supporting local businesses. And we want to tie it back to the complete streets. So take the momentum of putting an open street as a first step in order to create a more complete streets program plan in the downtown areas and across towns and cities. Building on success of these of an installation, as well as looking at what are people's concerns and issue, will help us plan better for future improvement and the street scale. And again, consider how complete streets demonstration projects could tie into implementation of maybe a seasonal open street that come back every year and showcase desire for future change. We compiled a few resources. We want to really kind of emphasize the CDTC has a really great open street webpage with many resources on that. And we have some additional here, some guidelines that could help you learn from other cities and see many other examples, including NACTO and other cities that have put this together. So we're moving into the Q&A session, and you're welcome to put your question in the chat. But one thing to just like start the conversation is to ask, what are people saying? What are some of the comments and feedback that we've heard about open streets? And I don't know if Mike or Kathy would like to start.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, what's going to be interesting is seeing how these programs evolve, you know, especially as life, you know, goes back to something closer to normal or closer to pre-pandemic. You know, we saw some of the stats that Jen showed earlier. You know, I think it looked like in the Albany region, transit ridership's actually pretty close to where it was before. And walking's up and driving is certainly back to where it was. So, you know, different communities are approaching it differently. I think that there's a desire to keep, you know, open streets in some form. Some places are even expanding it or making it permanent. But I do think that, you know, what we've learned is it requires some partnership with the community to do that. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, some of the concerns you hear are things that aren't too surprising, I guess, in this line of work, where if you're making it temporarily more difficult to get to a certain street with your car, and if people are used to being able to do it, you know, some people might grumble about it. And, you know, and some of those concerns might be legitimate, and there might be a way to adjust the project to you know, deal with it. And others is just, you know, all of us, myself included, as humans, you know, sometimes just kind of resist change. So, you know, there's a little bit of a period of adaptation.
Thank you, Mike.
So we don't yet have a question or answer or in the chat, but I was thinking that, Mike, you mentioned if we had more time, you wanted to talk about, I think it was Oakland. And you want to share a little bit more about that? And then hopefully feel free while he's talking to add a question in the chat or a Q&A so we can happy to answer those.
Yeah, please do type your questions in. Yeah, so with Oakland, you know, it was interesting. I think the initial effort that the city made, you know, there was a decent amount of kind of consultation with neighborhoods. But I think there was also, you know, Oakland is a city that has, it has a diversity of neighborhoods. It has, you know, areas with pretty significant minority populations. It has areas with some pretty significant poverty. I think there was a perception in some neighborhoods that the program was being kind of pushed, you know, down kind of from above and pushed on them rather than done with them, right? And that's something I remember that we even, you know, a kind of a quote we had in one of our previous webinars is, you know, do it with us, not to us. And I think, you know, what happened there, the mayor has a policy advisor who had a little more of a direct line of communication with, you know, the various neighborhoods in Oakland. And the advisor, you know, kind of worked with the transportation department to just reorient their program a little bit and kind of not start blank slate, but dial it back and really go back to the engagement phase and talk more to the communities about, you know, what would help them. Maybe open streets will help them, but maybe they would like to be the ones kind of weighing in on, you know, how it should be done or where it should be done. You know, in other cases, some blocks, you know, may not have wanted it, and so the city adjusted it. So yeah, I think in Oakland, I mean, the lesson was really about the importance of engagement, and in particular, kind of the process and the importance of the perception of communities, you know, that they're being involved, just as much as maybe the reality of what their involvement is. You know, I think folks have to feel like they're helping to drive it, especially if you feel like your neighborhood's been on the receiving end of a lot of things that, you know, you see as negative over the decades, or maybe that you haven't gotten the same investments that wealthier neighborhoods have. So, you know, I think there's a historical aspect that we have to take into account too. And that gets to the equity piece, you know.
So no questions so far. I'll just keep asking some, and we'll talk amongst ourselves until you want to chime in. But one of the things we were thinking about as we were developing the presentation was if it's more common to have temporary or seasonal installations, you know, from the spring to the fall, or have you, in the ones that you've worked on, have you seen any that have been continued year round through the winter?
Yes. So most of the open streets that we've been working on were related to a more seasonal and temporary use of the street. Looking in, if it's a restaurant, as we've seen before, if it's a more open street towards restaurants, then we're looking at a weekend closure, looking at the, you know, 3 nights, maybe from Thursday night to accommodate, you know, the different activity. If it's a school street, we also worked with a school here. So then it depends on their specific schedule, and it could be mostly to accommodate the breaks and maybe afternoon activities that they might have, and or more like an activity that they're having after school hours. So that really depends on what is the context of the open streets. I think there are a lot of places that are thinking what is the next version and how to make it more permanent, and not necessarily that it needs to be closed 24/7, but that it's is you know, part of the network looking forward. So in New York, there are many locations like the 34th Street that is looking for permanent solutions and more fundings to make the design of the streets accommodate the different activities that are now in the streets, accommodating pedestrian and bicycles.
Yeah, I see a question in the chat, which is, you know, really interesting. Actually, I think I see 2, but the first one is interesting. So the question is, you know, it's been good to see a shift to open streets, but there's also areas in their town where restaurants are taking over more of the sidewalk and the plazas, which actually might lead to less pedestrian area. You know, so how can we maintain the balance or assess how much space a restaurant really needs? Yeah, it's interesting. I was just thinking about this the other day. Some restaurants that were smaller, had less indoor seating, have like double or triple, I think, like the number of tables now. And I mean, it must be great for business, I guess, in a certain way. And then other, you know, and some of that's just the luck of the draw in terms of if you have sidewalk space where you're able to put it out or whatever. But I mean, I think it's a fair point that, you know, that can also take away from the pedestrian area. And I think there's 2 parts to that. You know, there's how much space they're taking, and there's also how do you keep kind of an accessible, you know, sidewalk for folks, you know, and not kind of force people to go up and down the curb and things like that. You know, I think maybe the overarching thing to keep in mind is that, you know, on a typical street, somewhere between 2/3 and 80% of the space is for cars. So, you know, if restaurant seating, you know, which generally is a nice thing, although, you know, maybe some neighbors have issues if it's noisier things. But if there's a desire for more of those kinds of uses, you know, do we need to be fighting over the scraps of, you know, the space that's not the roadway for cars? So I think, you know, one way to look at it is let's zoom out and think about that total street right of way. And okay, you know, is there a different way to divvy up the space? And even if we're not going to do a full pedestrian open street, can we repurpose the curb lanes? Can we maybe repurpose even a travel lane if there's more than one travel lane? Or maybe it's just a part-time, you know, really at those peak like weekend restaurant hours when they actually need that seating, that the road is closed to car traffic. And, you know, I mean, that would be my suggestion. I don't know if there's a way, honestly. I'm not aware of anything yet, research on how you determine kind of what's the right amount of seating for a restaurant. But, you know, I think generally, hopefully we can do both, right? Hopefully we can increase pedestrian space while also in a reasonable way, increasing the restaurant space. You know, and the other part, like I mentioned, is the accessibility aspect. So, you know, we didn't get into the details, but we've seen examples where, let's say the restaurant seating is put on the sidewalk and the pedestrians are in the road for whatever reason. So you need to make sure you have really good Americans with Disabilities Act compliant ramps so for people, but that's probably not the ideal setup. Ideally, the seating would go in the road so that pedestrians just have a clear straight path along the sidewalk. But that's another consideration. I don't know if Leon or Kathy, if you want to add to that.
What we've learned when we researched other location, it's when they're looking at the permanent program of outdoor dining, they might consider bringing fees back, and that will, you know, balance in some level the amount of space that are being used to what they really need, but also could use this in order to benefit other projects and other programs within public space in different towns. So I think that's another point to bring up, that in order to balance, maybe for a permanent project, a permanent program, you would consider fees.
That's a great point. And actually, it makes me think of a couple other things. You know, obviously, if you're using the curb lane, that's going to naturally limit how much you can put out. The sidewalk, you know, it would be good to have some kind of standards around sort of a minimum, you know, clear area. And that may depend on which part of town you're in, right? If you're in a more commercial, denser area versus a kind of a lower scale area. You know, I would suggest for things like plazas, you know, those should really be public space. And I know that in some instances, they may be used for concessions like cafes or for restaurant seating. You know, we all think maybe of like the quintessential European plaza where, you know, the restaurant seating kind of spills out onto it. But I think you need a nuanced approach that, you know, has some type of clear limits on how much of the seating and how much of the space is purely public versus how much of it can actually be, you know, essentially privatized. It's a very valid concern. Sorry, Kathy.
No, that's okay. I was just going to add that I think part of it too was a lot of the measures in the 2020 pandemic season were very temporary, and even in terms of the ADA ramps, where they were just, you know, they built a wooden ramp to use to get around the outdoor seating from the sidewalk down to the street level for pedestrian access. And I think as we see these installations becoming more common every summer or even permanent, we're going to find a little bit more of you know, focus on making sure everything is more, you know, better done so that people have that access, that there is a little bit more than the 4 feet width required for sidewalk as well. So I just want to note that. And there was another note in the chat, just so you know, about the previous 2 parts of the Complete Streets Nuvisions webinar presentations, and Jen did post the link in the chat, or where you can find them. There are recordings available, so you could look at the first 2 in the series too. Did anyone else have any other questions that we can answer? Okay, Not seeing any right now. Jen, did you want to have any closing thoughts for everyone, or?
Sure. If there are no other questions or anything, I just want to thank everyone for attending today. I really would like to thank Planning for Places and Sam Schwartz Engineering for putting together this really great series, and also, you know, our CDTC staff, Carrie Ward and Chris Bauer, have been, you know, incredibly helpful in helping us put this together. So we hope that folks stay engaged with our virtual learning series beyond Complete Streets, but if you have other ideas or that you would like more information on Complete Streets, please contact us. We'd be happy to put together you know, a small virtual presentation or small training on Nuvisions or topics within Nuvisions for your planning or zoning board, town board, or city council. So I think that's it. I hope everyone stays safe and enjoys the rest of their summer.
Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.